All right, so someone on my Discord asked if I could kind of explain Redux. I'm going to use Redux Toolkit in this little video. So if you're using the older style of Redux, where you have to like have all these actions and it's just a mess. But let me just kind of explain how you can use Redux Toolkit. You can read through the docs. It's pretty straightforward. But I think it's more important to understand like why do we use Redux? Why do we use state management? So I have this little application here where there's a text area that you could type into, or an input box, and the idea is I want to have this input box filter the results on this component. Okay, so the blue is kind of meaning that this is component of the filter component, and the orange means that there's a separate component here. So if we look at the actual code, this is what the application looks like. You have a filter component and you got a products component, right? Now let me kind of show you what the issue is. If you type into the filter, it has its own state, right? So it sets its own state internally, and this is all kind of encapsulated away. So there's no way for this products component to know about what the user has put into the search box. So when I type into here, it doesn't do anything. So that's the first thing I want to kind of show you and solve with you, because it's important to understand like why do we have state management? Why do we have to use Redux or context or Zustan? It's basically the share state between components. And sorry if my kids are making noise. They're in the room next to me playing with blocks. But anyway, so we have this component. The first thing we need to do is, in order to have this state, the filter state that the user types in shared with the products, you have to elevate state. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do it with elevating state. You basically just pull this out. You put it at a higher level like this. Make sure you auto import the stuff that you might need. And I'm just going to go ahead and put those in as arguments. So I'll say this passes in filter and also set filter. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. We're basically pulling the state out of filter and we're going to be passing that in. Okay, so that is kind of how you do it. This thing doesn't need use state anymore. And the second thing you need to do is we need to pass the filter that the user has typed in into this property here, right? So if I pull state out and I pass the filter in here as a property, let me show you what happens here. So filter by is a prop that is being used for filtering out all the products. I didn't really explain this products component, but it just has an array of 3 products and we want to filter through them by name. Okay, so just basically whatever the user types into the input box, loop through and filter out the products that don't match that. Simple enough, right? So let's make sure this works. So if I type in like eggs, it filters down to eggs. Type in P, A, we get paper and pants. Type in P, we get pants. So our filter is working great, but this is kind of messy, right? The fact that you had to pull some state out of filter, bring it up a level just to be able to do what we needed to do is kind of like not the best developer experience. And as your application gets larger, it's harder to refactor components and move them around, because now you have to like have this component state coupled to this component state, and like you have to like know how to like pull stuff out. It's just a mess. So this is one reason why you might want to use something like context. So instead of using state, you could use context up here and wrap all these so that both of these can access whatever the heck they need in state or via the context. But I mean, we're talking about Redux here. So let's talk about Redux Toolkit. I already set this up in the project. I mean, follow the README. It's not that hard to follow. But you basically install like 2 packages, like Redux/Toolkit and then Redux. And once you have those set up, you have to create a store file. So we have a basic store set up, which has something called a reducer. I'm not going to get into the details what the reducer is, but this is basically just like a naming of like where you store your state. Okay, so I have some state called product filter. This is the name that we're going to use. We'll see this later on. And that is mapping to a filter slice reducer. So that comes from something called a slice. When you're using Redux Toolkit, there's like a convention called slices, which is a way to kind of like chunk up your state into small manageable files, I guess you could say, or like pieces of functionality. So in this case, all we need to care about is filtering. So I made a slice called filter slice. And to kind of get this going, you import create slice. You give it some initial state. So we just want to keep track of what the user typed in. So we have a filter key here. set to an empty string. And then we have something called a reducer. So a reducer are methods that you can call on your slice to modify the state of your thing, right? So in our case, since all we need to care about is the string filter, we just had one method called set filter, but you can do whatever you want. You can make as many methods as you want here. Like I could add one called clear filter. And behind the scenes, what this is doing is this is using Emmer to allow you to use like a mutatable approach for changing your state. You know how typically in Redux or sorry, in React, you have to like do, I don't know, like set state, and then you have to like pass it a callback function like this, and then you have to do like something like this. All this nasty extra code that's really annoying. Well, behind the scenes, Redux Toolkit is using Emmer, so you can just basically mutate your state properties as you want, and it all just works really nicely. So you kind of create your slice, you make sure you export it. You also can export all the actions. So actions are the things that you're going to be calling from your JSX components to basically change your state. Okay, so in this case, you have an action called set filter, and that happens to just come from this set filters. It's kind of confusing why this is called actions, and this is set inside of reducers. But basically, whatever you do .actions, it's going to be the same key values as this. Kind of confusing, but I guess it makes sense if you think about it. And then we export the reducer here. So in order to hook this all up into your Redux store, you had to make sure you exported the reducer. So if I go back to the store, that's where we're kind of importing the reducer here and just setting that up. And then let's just try to get this going. So the first step we need to do is we don't care about storing state here anymore. So let's delete that. And let's delete this. And then we don't want to pass props in. This filter component should have direct access to the filter. And then this component should also have direct access to the filter. Okay, so we're just refactoring our code to make it work with Redux Toolkit. First thing is I'm going to go to the filter component. So inside the filter component, we need to basically change two things. First thing we need to do is be able to get that filter state from the slice. So I'm going to say const filter is equal to use selector. All right, so when you want to grab state from your store, you basically have to use a use selector hook. So this takes a callback function, and you can grab back the actual name of the different reducers you have set up. So in our case, we have a product filter. So we have to do state.product filter. And then in that product filter, remember we have the initial state is equal to this, right? So we have a filter here. All right, so let's go ahead and just remove the filter stuff, the props here. We don't need those anymore. So now the state is actually coming from, or the filter variable is coming from our actual state slice, right? So hopefully this all makes sense. We're using a selector to basically get that string from our filter slice here, okay? The second thing we need to do is when the user types into the input box, instead of calling set filter, which doesn't exist anymore, we need to call this action, right? So there's an action called set filter, which we need to kind of dispatch. That's another keyword when you're dealing with Redux dispatch. So we need to first bring in the dispatch function like so, which I think you just do this, use dispatch. And then once you have dispatch, you can actually call your actions using the dispatch. So let's make sure we auto import that action from our filter slice. And when the user types into this input, we're going to dispatch that action and make sure you pass that action to payload. Okay, so this is how you basically tell this component when the user types in to call this, which is going to update state, which is going to update this basically. And then that's going to reload the component because we're fetching it here. And then we're rendering on here. It's a huge rabbit hole. It's like a big loop of stuff, but this is kind of how it works. And then the next step is we need to use that state inside of the products component. So let's just go ahead and copy this, and we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to paste that in and make sure we auto import use selector. So we're going to do the exact same use selector kind of call to get that filter. And instead, I'm actually going to call this filter by, because I think that's what we called it before. So let's go ahead and delete that. All right, so if this is all set up correctly, now when I type in eggs, this should all filter correctly now, right? And this is all working through Redux. So I believe if I use this Redux Toolkit helper here and just go ahead and clear this out, reset. So as I type in, notice that every time I type, it's calling a action, it's dispatching an action. And on the right here, I can see how my state is changing inside of my Redux store over time. Okay. So you can kind of dive into this and learn more about this little debugger. Honestly, this thing's not that useful when you actually start building out your applications. I've maybe figured out 1 or 2 bugs using this, but overall, like, console logs just do the thing. Yeah, so basically, why would you use Redux over something like Context? It's really a personal preference. I think Redux is nice because it gives you this little debugger tool. If you find this stuff useful, like maybe you might want to use it. I don't really find this useful, to be honest, but maybe other people do. I would personally use Zustan for my state management. And then also the question is, what do you put in your Redux store? What do you put in global state? Honestly, it's stuff that you find too hard to kind of pass around. Like in this example, I probably wouldn't have refactored it from the prop drilling in elevating state. I think it was fine in that instance to just have the state declared inside an app and pass it around. If for whatever reason you think it's getting too messy or it's becoming very, very hard to refactor components because of the way you've done stuff, maybe go for the next better option, which might be context. So, use the context tool that React provides you to see if you can easily share some state between your components. If that doesn't help you out, I would maybe reach for something like Zustan because it's super easy to share state with Zustan and it's really a low, it's a minimal library. But if you were on a project where you want to have some consistency and like everyone needs to do state management the same way, and then more specifically, you need to store something such as server state. There's another topic you should probably read up on, which is called RTK query. So sometimes you want to like get data from the backend, store it in your Redux store, and have that act as a cache. We're not going to get into like what the whole concept of server state is, but you can do that with Redux Toolkit query. It's kind of a competitor to React query, but it's built into Redux. So check that out if that's something that you're interested in doing. But honestly, like there's no hard or fast rule about like what goes into Redux stores, what goes into your component state, what should not go into component state. Just use your intuition, use what works best for your application, and refactor it when stuff becomes too unmanageable, right? Sometimes putting everything in Redux becomes super unmanageable, so it might make more sense to not do it. But there's no silver bullet. I can't really tell you the best approaches until you start building out your application and you can find that out for yourself. Anyway, hopefully that was a good overview of how to use Redux Toolkit, how some of this stuff works. I know I didn't show you exactly how to set it up from the get-go, but honestly, you just install 2 packages, you create a store. Oh, I think I forgot to show you the provider. So inside of index, which one is this? Inside of main.jsx, you just have to make sure you wrap your main app with a provider so that all your components have access to using those use selector hooks, those use dispatch hooks, etc. So that was kind of a key thing I kind of left out. But just, read through the docs. It's not hard to read through the docs and get this thing set up. I think it's more interesting to understand like what's the purpose of these slices? How do you use them to kind of split up your state inside your React components? Anyway, have a good day and happy coding.